It was the kind of morning that doesn't make promises. Overcast, gray sitting on top of gray. The clouds over St. James's Park had that particular London heaviness. Not threatening rain exactly, more like reminding you that rain was always a possibility, always lurking just behind the next hour. A Tuesday, early October. The trees had started letting go of their leaves, but hadn't committed to it yet, so the ground along the mall was patchy. Half summer, half something else. I've been standing at that railing for maybe 40 minutes before any of it happened. This is the thing people don't tell you about watching the changing of the guard. You wait. A long time. The ceremony itself is somewhere between 15 and 30 minutes depending on who you ask, but the waiting, that's the real experience. That's where you learn things. Because when you're standing in one spot for 40-odd minutes with nothing to do, but look, you start actually looking. Most tourists don't. Most tourists pull out their phones before anything's even started and stare at the screen of the thing they're trying to capture instead of the thing itself. I'd seen it happen 100 times. Someone flies 11 hours from Singapore or Sao Paulo or Saskatchewan. They stand in front of one of the most recognizable pieces of ceremony in the world, and they watch it through a 4-inch rectangle of glass. I wasn't judging. I'd done it myself on my first visit. This time I'd left the phone in my jacket pocket. Deliberate decision. I wanted to actually be there. So I was actually there, and because I was actually there, I noticed. The 2 guards posted at the palace gates that morning were different in the way that people who do the same job can still be completely different people inside the same uniform. You pick up on it when you're paying attention. The one on the left, I'll call him the older one, though I couldn't tell you his exact age. Maybe late 20s, maybe early 30s. It's impossible to tell when they're in bearskin hats. Had that settled quality about him. That I have stood in this exact spot in rain, in sun, in fog, and I will stand here again tomorrow quality. His stillness wasn't rigid. It was rested, like a tree that's grown accustomed to wind. The one on the right was something else. I noticed him before I noticed anything wrong. Just noticed him, the way you notice a word that doesn't quite fit in a sentence. He was in full dress, the scarlet tunic, the bearskin cap sitting perfectly level, white-gloved hands at his sides, rifle at the correct angle. From 20 yards away, if you glanced and moved on, you'd see nothing. Perfect uniform, perfect posture, but it wasn't glancing and moving on. His jaw was doing something. Just the smallest thing, a tightening and releasing, like he was chewing something that wouldn't break down. His eyes were fixed forward the way they're trained to be, but there was something happening behind the forward. Something working, something that had nothing to do with the tourists or the November gray sky or the slow approach of the ceremony. I'd watched enough guards in my time to know that the stillness they achieve is a kind of active thing. It takes effort. It is, in a technical sense, performance. Not in the theatrical way, but in the athletic way. The way holding a plank position is a performance of your whole body working against its own instinct to collapse. This one was fighting harder than usual. I couldn't tell you why I thought that. I just did. The crowd had built up by then. It does that slowly, you don't notice it happening, and then you turn around and there are 300 people behind you wondering how you got to the front. The tour groups had arrived with their matching lanyards and their guides holding numbered paddles in the air. A school group from somewhere, the children wearing yellow high-visibility vests, bouncing on the balls of their feet, entirely uninterested in anything a guard was doing because guards don't do anything as far as a 9-year-old is concerned. An elderly Japanese couple stood directly to my left with a film camera, actual film, not digital, and I found myself watching them almost as much as the guards. The man held the camera. The woman held a small notebook and wrote things in it. What she was writing, I don't know. Her observations, maybe her own version of what she was seeing. I like that. The notebook. The sound of the morning was layered. Traffic from the mall, muffled but present. The pigeons doing their pigeon business around the Victoria Memorial. Someone's phone playing a notification sound. Children. A tour guide delivering a practiced explanation in German. Under all of it, from somewhere beyond the palace gates, the very first distant strains of the approaching band, a sound you feel more than hear at first, a low brass warmth that the air carries before your ears quite register it. The guard on the right heard it too. I know because his jaw stopped moving. just for a second, like something in him recognized the sound and stood at attention inside the rigidity. And then the jaw started again. There was a woman near me, British, I was fairly certain. The way her coat was tied suggested she knew how cold it actually was rather than how cold it looked, who leaned toward her companion and said something low. Her companion nodded. They were both looking at the guard on the right. So it wasn't just me. That's the thing. When you're standing in a crowd watching something, there's a moment when you realize the crowd has silently agreed on what to watch. No announcement, no consensus, just a collective turning of attention toward a particular point. It happened here, quietly, without anyone saying a word about it. The guard on the right took a breath. Not a dramatic breath, not a heaving chest situation, just a visible breath. The kind you take when you've made a decision you haven't quite finished making. The older guard beside him didn't move, didn't look, whatever peripheral awareness he had. And these men are trained to have extraordinary peripheral awareness, registered nothing, or registered it, and filed it under not my business, and stayed exactly where he was. The approaching band was clearer now. A crisp, processional sound, the kind of music designed specifically to make human beings stand up straighter. It works even on civilians. I felt it in my own spine. And then the guard on the right stepped back. One step, back, off the post. Not a fall, not a stumble. A deliberate, controlled, almost gentle step back, the way you might step away from a painting to see it differently. His rifle stayed at his side. His back stayed straight. He didn't look at the crowd. He didn't look at his colleague. He looked at the gate, at the painted metal of it, the royal crest, the old black iron. He looked at it for maybe 3 seconds. Then he turned, walked left, through the narrow passageway that runs along the facade of the palace, the one the public can't access, the one that exists for the people who belong there. He walked through it at the same pace you'd walk to retrieve something you'd forgotten, unhurried, controlled, like a man who has decided something and has enough dignity left not to run. He was gone. The post beside the older guard was empty. Nobody screamed. Nobody ran. Nobody grabbed a radio and shouted into it. The older guard didn't move. That was the thing that made my brain stutter. The absolute, architectural stillness of the older guard in the face of the empty space beside him. His eyes didn't cut left to check. His posture didn't shift a single degree. He stood there in his post, and he performed the same stillness he'd been performing for however many minutes before, and the absence of his colleague was nothing, registered as nothing, acknowledged as nothing. The woman in the coat looked at her companion. Her companion looked back. Neither of them said anything. The band was close now. The yellow-vested children had stopped bouncing. Not because they understood what had happened. They couldn't have, but because children are seismographs, and something in the frequency of the moment had changed, and they felt it. I looked at the empty post. I looked at the older guard. I looked at the empty post again. And I had the strangest thought, the kind of thought that arrives fully formed and slightly too large for the moment that produced it. He's pretending it isn't happening because the ceremony is more real than the reason it's happening. I don't know if that was right. I don't know if it was even a coherent thought. But it landed in me and stayed there, and I kept standing at the railing, and the band rounded the corner in a wash of brass and percussion, and the guard who remained stood perfectly still beside the space where a man used to be. Here's what the ceremony looked like from where I was standing. Perfectly normal. The new detachment moved in their practice formation, scarlet tunics, bearskins level, rifles at the prescribed angle. The outgoing detachment formed up. The handover, the whole theatrical grammar of it, the slow march, the precise footwork, the choreography that is simultaneously military ritual and national performance, proceeded with the total indifference of something that has been happening long enough to have become its own kind of force of nature. The empty post was filled within 6 minutes. A replacement guard, appearing from the same passageway the other one had walked into, took position with the same absence of ceremony that the departure had carried. He arrived. He stood. He became part of the line. His face said nothing. His posture said nothing. He was from the outside, indistinguishable from any other man in that uniform on that morning. And just like that, the gap was sealed. But gaps, once you've seen them, don't unsee themselves. The woman in the coat. I've been aware of her throughout. The way you become aware of a particular detail once you've registered it. Turned to her companion after the replacement guard had been standing for maybe 2 minutes. She said something. Low, clipped, unmistakably British in its understatement. Her companion gave a very small nod, the kind that means yes, I know, and I don't quite know what to do with it either. They didn't leave. They stayed for the rest of the ceremony. Most people did. The school group, the Japanese couple with the film camera, the tour groups in their lanyards. All of them stayed and watched the rest of the ceremony play out, the music, the marching, the formal business of it. And if any of them had seen what happened, and some of them must have 300 people standing in the same direction, can't all have been looking at their screens at the same moment. None of them mentioned it. Not out loud. Not to anyone around them. I found that extraordinary. Not the silence exactly. I understood the silence. There's a particular social mechanism that kicks in when you witness something that doesn't have an obvious category, something that isn't quite wrong, but isn't quite right, something that sits in the gray space between incident and nothing. The mechanism says, wait, don't aim it yet. See what the structure around it does. And the structure, the ceremony, the guards, the palace gates, was behaving as if nothing had happened. So the crowd followed the structure. The crowd is almost always going to follow the structure. What I found extraordinary was the texture of the silence. It wasn't a forgetting. It was a choosing. People knew, and they let it go, and watched the band, and took their photographs. I stayed after most of the crowd dispersed. Not for any particular reason. I'm not a journalist. I wasn't on assignment. I was just a person who'd come to watch a ceremony and ended up watching something adjacent to it, something unscheduled, and I had nowhere urgent to be and a head full of the thing I'd seen. The replacement guard stood where he stood. Impassive. Correct. The older guard stood where he stood. Impassive. Correct. Between them, now that there were fewer people and the noise had dropped, there was a quality of space that felt different to ordinary pavement. Not haunted. That's too dramatic and also wrong. But used. The way a chair that someone has sat in for years feels different from a new one. The space held the memory of what had stood in it, briefly and without ceremony and apparently without consequence. I thought about the guard who'd left, not in a sentimental way, more in the way you think about a stranger you've passed on the street who was crying. The thinking that isn't intrusion so much as the mind trying to fill in a shape it has been given without context. Who was he before the uniform? What was happening in the life that existed on the other side of the gates, the real one, the one without bearskins and white gloves, and the specific dignity of standing perfectly still while tourists photograph you? What had broken, or bent, or simply reached its limit on a Tuesday morning in October under a gray London sky? I didn't know, couldn't know, but the question had weight. A security officer, not in ceremonial dress, in the day-to-day uniform, the practical one, walked past the gates at some point during the next 20 minutes. Walked past, not stopping, not slowing, with the purposeful stride of someone who has a destination and is going to it. His eyes moved across the guards the way eyes move across something familiar enough not to require assessment. He didn't look at the replacement guard longer than the original. He didn't look at the space. I watched him until he turned a corner, and then I looked back at the gates, and the older guard was still there, and the replacement was still there, and the sky was still doing its gray thing, and the tourists who remained were doing their tourist thing, and London was doing its London thing. The city doesn't pause for what it doesn't acknowledge. That's a fact I've always known about London, intellectually. Living, breathing, moving, enormous London. It has seen too much and stood through too long to stop for a single departure. Kings have died inside those gates. Empires have been negotiated in those rooms behind that facade. A guard who steps back and walks away is in the accounting of a city that old, a very small ledger entry. And yet, I want to tell you about the older guard hands because I spent a significant amount of time looking at them, and they told me something I think matters. White glove, like I said, rifle at his side, the regulation grip, not tight, not loose, the precise tension that keeps a position held without trembling. His hands had been in this position for the entirety of the morning, through the departure, through the gap, through the replacement's arrival, through the ceremony, through the dispersal of the crowd. They were absolutely still. Not the stillness of a statue, which is passive, which doesn't have a choice. The active stillness. The kind that refuses movement. The kind that costs something. And I thought, standing there in the cooling morning, watching a man in an enormous hat refuse to acknowledge what had happened beside him, I thought that maybe this is its own kind of strength. Not the strength of the dramatic gesture. Not the strength of the speech or the confrontation or the public reckoning. The strength of the post held. The discipline honored, even when the man beside you has decided he can't honor it anymore. Maybe not. Maybe it was something else entirely. Maybe it was the opposite of strength, the trained incapacity to deviate, the institutional lock on the body that prevents the perfectly natural human response of turning to look at the space where a person used to be. I couldn't tell the difference from where I stood. Perhaps that's the point. A small boy, maybe 7, maybe 8, had gotten separated from his group. His yellow vest was slightly too large for him, the shoulders drooping, and he drifted to the front of the thinning crowd and stood directly in front of the gates, looking up at the 2 remaining guards with the open, unguarded curiosity of a child who hasn't yet learned that looking directly at people is sometimes considered rude. He stared at the older guard for a long time. Then, he stared at the replacement guard. Then, he looked at the space between them, the space that wasn't a space anymore, now that a man occupied it. And then he looked back at the older guard, as if he was trying to solve something, like his very young brain was doing the arithmetic of presence and absence and coming up with a sum he didn't have a word for yet. He looked over his shoulder at me. I don't know why at me specifically. There were other people. But he looked at me. I shrugged. The universal gesture for I don't know either kid. He turned back to the guards, studied them for another few seconds. Then his group found him, a teacher with the frazzled particularity of someone who has counted and recounted children all morning, and he was collected and absorbed back into the yellow-vested cluster and moved along. He looked back once, still trying to solve it. The ceremony had been over for 40 minutes when I finally left the railing. My feet had that standing for too long ache that starts in the arch and radiates up through the calf if you ignore it long enough. The coffee I'd had that morning had worn off in the way that good coffee does, leaving a very specific quality of tired that is somehow more noticeable than the tiredness before the coffee. The gray sky had not committed to rain or resolution. It simply continued being gray, indifferent to whatever conclusions I'd been drawing underneath it. I walked back along the mall, the trees doing their reluctant autumn thing, the tourists doing their tourist thing, the city doing its city thing. And behind me, at their posts, the guard standing in the morning, holding a line in the space where something had happened and been smoothed over so quickly and so completely that if you hadn't been standing at that railing, not taking photographs, actually looking, you'd never have known anyone had been there at all that I came back the next morning. I'm aware of how that sounds. I'm aware it edges towards something, obsession, maybe, or the particular restlessness of a person who has witnessed an incomplete thing and cannot close the file. But it wasn't dramatic. I came back because I was still in London, and because the thing I'd seen the previous morning had sat with me through the whole of the afternoon, and the dinner I barely tasted, and the long, ceiling-staring hour before sleep arrived, and I thought that maybe standing in the same spot again would do something to the weight of it. Dissipate it, maybe, or clarify it, or just give it somewhere to go. Different morning. Same gates. The sky had made its decision overnight. Proper autumn rain, a fine, persistent drizzle that wasn't dramatic enough to warrant an umbrella, but thoroughly wet enough to remind you it was there. The tourists were fewer. Rainy days thinned the crowd at the gates. The changing of the guard loses some of its appeal when the ceremony must be observed through the soft lens of English drizzle. The guards at the posts were different guards. Of course they were. This is obvious in retrospect, and I'd known it intellectually before I arrived. These men rotate. It's a roster, not a monument, but the knowing and the seeing are two different things, and when I arrived at the railing and saw 2 different men in the same uniforms at the same posts, something in me registered it as a kind of loss, which is irrational, which I recognized as irrational, which didn't stop it from happening. Neither of these men was the older guard. Neither of them was the one who'd left. They were simply 2 men in scarlet, and black in the October rain, doing the job. I want to talk about the job for a moment because I think I've been thinking about it wrong. When I picture what most people imagine a Royal Guards Day involves, and I was guilty of this too before yesterday, there's a ceremonial quality to it that renders the human element almost decorative. The uniform is so elaborate, the tradition so codified, the restriction on movements so absolute, that it's easy to see the guards as accessories to the institution rather than people within it. Living props, human fixtures. The performance obscures the labor. Standing still is not passive. We've established this. But here's the piece I've been missing. The stillness is not just physical. You are also required to be still in every other direction. Emotionally still in full public view, with strangers inches from your face making strange noises and strange requests and strange assumptions about whether you are, in fact, a person who experiences things. You cannot respond. You cannot explain. You cannot acknowledge that you have heard anything, felt anything, noticed anything. For hours, in all weather, on a Tuesday, on a day when something inside you has already decided it's done. I thought about that. The day when something inside you has already decided, for a long time, standing at the railing with the drizzle collecting on the shoulders of my jacket. Because here's the thing I kept circling. The guard who left had still shown up. He'd gotten up that morning. He'd put on the uniform. That elaborate, impractical, historically significant uniform, which takes time and care and specific knowledge to wear correctly. He'd done the laces, the gloves, the positioning of the hat. He'd traveled to the palace, reported for duty, been assigned his post, marched out to it in formation, and taken position beside his colleague. He'd done all of it. And then, at some point between taking position and the approaching sound of the band, something had reached its limit. Some internal calculation had completed. The math had come back wrong, and he'd read the answer, and the answer had said, "Not today. Not this morning. Not this one more time." And he'd stepped back. What I kept returning to, all through the drizzly second morning, and the walk back along the mall, and the coffee I sat with for too long in a cafe on a side street off St. James's, is the question of what it costs. Not the leaving, the staying. Both the man who left and the man who remained paid something on that Tuesday morning. Different currencies, different rates. The man who left paid whatever you pay when you break from a thing that has defined your mornings and your posture and your public self. The cost of that rupture, which is real and serious and not something I'm equipped to calculate from the outside. But the man who remained, he paid something too, to stay in his post while the post beside him became a gap, to not turn, to not look, to continue performing the stillness that the institution requires while beside him a human decision happened, unfolding in real time, and the institution's only response was to close the gap as efficiently as possible and carry on. He made a choice too. The choice to let the structure hold him, even when the structure revealed itself, for one visible, unsmoothable moment, as something a man could simply step away from. The rain intensified slightly, the way London rain sometimes does, doubling down on itself in the afternoon, and I turned up my collar and looked at the two guards at their posts and thought about something my father used to say. He'd been in the military. Not British, a different army, a different country a long time ago. He'd served for 7 years and left, and when I was old enough to ask him why he'd left, he'd told me something that I'd carried without fully understanding until that moment at the railing. He said, the hardest part wasn't the hard days. The hardest part was showing up on the ordinary days and remembering why the ordinary days mattered. He'd paused, the way he paused when he was deciding whether to add something, and then he'd added, most people who leave don't leave on the hard days. They leave on a Tuesday when the sky is gray, and they've been standing in the same spot for long enough to start asking questions that the institution doesn't have answers for. He'd said it without judgment, without admiration, just as a fact. I'd filed it away and moved on, the way you do with the things adults tell you that are too large for the moment you hear them. Standing in the rain, I retrieved it. There's a particular kind of tourism that I'd been resisting thinking of myself as engaged in, but honesty forces me to name it. I've been witnessing someone's worst professional moment, or whatever the moment was. I still don't know the actual story, and turning it into an experience of my own. An observation, a set of thoughts about institution and labor and the nature of stillness. That's a form of appropriation, isn't it? The witness making meaning from someone else's fracture. I sat with that uncomfortable thought for a while, and then I thought, maybe this is also what stories are. The fracture passes through a stranger's body, and a witness is standing there, and the witness carries it forward in the only way they can, which is imperfect and incomplete and filtered through all the wrong things. Their own history, their own father's words, their own standing at railings and going back the next morning. Maybe the story of the guard who left belongs to him, and the story of what it looked like from the outside belongs to whoever was standing outside. Both things true, neither complete. I'll tell you what I didn't do. I didn't ask anyone working at the palace what had happened. I didn't seek out a journalist. I didn't go home and dig through military forums trying to find an account that matched, or search news aggregators for a story about an incident at the gates on an October Tuesday. Some things should be left to hold their own weight. If I found out, if someone handed me the full, explained, reported account of who that man was and what his medical record said or what his commanding officer's report concluded, I think it would do something to the thing I'd actually seen. Collapse it into the explicable, file it away under a category, and seal the folder. I didn't want that. I wanted the unanswered version to stay unanswered, because the unanswered version had done something to me, something I'm still, honestly, not entirely sure how to name. It made me think about what it means to hold a post, what it means to perform duty when the person beside you has decided that the performance costs more than they can currently afford, what the institution owes the man inside the uniform, and what the uniform owes the institution, and whether those debts ever fully settle. I don't have clean answers to any of those questions. I don't think they're the kind of questions that have clean answers. The ceremony the following morning proceeded without incident. The two guards at the post stood where they stood. The band approached with its particular brass warmth. The tourists gathered and photographed and dispersed. The pigeons conducted their ongoing negotiations with gravity around the Victoria Memorial. The sky remained determined in its grayness. The city moved. I watched all of it. Before I left, I looked at the gates for a long moment. The painted iron, the royal crest, the old reliable solidity of the thing. And I thought about the man who'd stood there. The one who'd shown up, put on a uniform, taken his post, heard the band coming, and made a different decision than the one the institution expected of him. I thought, I hope he's okay. Not in a performative way. Not in the way you say it when you don't mean it. In the actual way. The way you mean it about a stranger whose specific situation you'll never know, and whose name you never knew, and whose face you can only half remember now. The jaw-tightening detail, the controlled step backward. I hope the morning after was lighter than the morning of. I hope whatever the institution said or did or decided was proportionate to whatever the morning held for him. Proportionate in the direction of mercy, which institutions are not always known for. I hope the space he left was eventually quietly filled, not just in the line at the gates, but in him, the interior space, the one no uniform can touch. I walked back along the mall for the last time on that trip. The leaves were further along in their falling. The trees more committed to the season than they'd been 2 days prior. A woman was feeding the ducks at the edge of the lake, not paying attention to anything but the ducks, and I thought, that's a good thing to be doing. A useful way to spend a gray London morning. Overhead, the clouds were considering moving on, not promising anything, just reconsidering their position. I know the feeling. The gates of Buckingham Palace sat behind me as I walked north, as they have sat for 200 years, containing their ceremonies and their traditions and their practiced, uninterrupted dignity. Inside them, men in bearskins were probably eating breakfast or being briefed or sitting in that specific way that people sit when they have shift coming and are conserving themselves for it. Somewhere in that building, or in another building across London, or in a flat that he'd gone back to on a Tuesday morning, still in some version of the early day, a man who had stepped away from a post was doing something. Sleeping, making tea, staring at a ceiling, calling someone, not calling anyone, standing at a window with the particular weight of the morning on his shoulders. I don't know which. I don't get to know. That's the honest end to this. Not a revelation. Not a lesson with a bow on it. Just a thing I saw, held as carefully as I know how to hold it, with the shape of the gap still visible, and the certainty that whatever it meant more than the ceremony it interrupted.